Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Connor Moran. I am the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival coming to you from Madison Public Library. I think I'm the only person in the entire library right now. I want to welcome you to our joint event with the Portland Book Festival, the Believer Festival, and the Loft's Wordplay, featuring Salman Rushdie this evening. It is an absolute treat and an honor to be able to bring this event to all of you. Working alongside the three other directors who are not here on the screen, Sara Ortiz, Amanda Bullock, and Steph Opitz, has been an absolute delight over the last couple of months from the time that we all began our stay-at-home orders, and the four of us started talking about what we could do that would be revolutionary and kind of magical. And this was one of the things that came up, and we really appreciate Salman for agreeing to do it, agreeing to postpone it so that we could spend time thinking about all of the civil rights issues that we need to be thinking about and we'll discuss this evening. So without further ado, I want to welcome Salman Rushdie to the stage, as well as Steph Opitz.
Hi everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, as Connor said, on behalf of the Loft Literary Center for our Book Festival Wordplay, along with the wonderful other festivals, Portland, Believer, and Wisconsin. It's so exciting to be able to be here virtually together across the country and world to celebrate one of the most famous people, let alone writers, in the world. It's such a special treat to have Salman join us tonight. It feels a little silly to even come up with a introduction because I know everyone here knows who you are. The Booker Prize darling, the author of 20 books, most recently Quixote, which we'll be discussing tonight. There's even a pronunciation in the beginning, which I found very useful to practice pronouncing the title correctly, even though I just botched it. But I would love to, before we get started, remind folks that you can buy Salman's book at the link below. And also, if you have questions for him in a little while, we'll move it over to audience questions. And there's a little Ask a Question tab where you can enter your questions, and I will try to get to them. So without further ado, Salman, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hey, hello, how are you? This is first for me, this kind of multiple festival all at one go. So I'm happy to be talking to all of you all over the country. It's hello from New York.
I would tell people what this book is about, but no one is here to hear my version of this. And I feel like it's kind of a complicated one to describe. So if you could give us kind of your elevator pitch for the book and then maybe a little reading, that would be.
Yeah. Well, what I wanted to do was to write some kind of a panoramic novel that which went across the country. You know, and I mean, the two books I'd written immediately before this were more or less entirely set in New York City. And I remember thinking, even while I was writing the previous book, The Golden House, that I needed to leave town. I needed to get out of the 212 area code. and so I had this idea of wanting to write a kind of a road novel. And then just by chance, I was asked to read and write something about Don Quixote. And so I looked at that book, which I hadn't really read since I was a college student, you know, and it gave me the idea for a version of Don Quixote and his Sancho Panza as being the people who would go across the country for me, you know, and very quickly they became not very like the originals, you know. I mean, actually, my Sancho has, I think, more in common with Pinocchio than Sancho Panza, in that he's an imaginary child created out of his father's need for a child, who then wants desperately to become real, you know. And the thing I liked about the way my character of Quixote developed is that he's incredibly optimistic. Right? He's absurdly optimistic, even when there's really no reason for it. And I thought, if I can just launch that spirit of optimism across the country, at what might not be the most optimistic moment in its history. Then the kind of the contrast and the tension between those things would be interesting. So basically, that's what he does. It's a road novel in which these two kind of buffoons travel across America and on a quest for love. And the bit I'm going to read, which is just from the beginning, kind of explains a bit about that. He's you will see, he's somebody who's obsessed by and somewhat deranged by watching terrible television. There once lived at a series of temporary addresses across the United States of America a traveling man of Indian origin, advancing years, and retreating mental powers, who, on account of his love for mindless television, had spent far too much of his life in the yellow light of tawdry motel rooms, watching in excess of it, and had suffered a peculiar form of brain damage as a result. He devoured morning shows, daytime shows, late-night talk shows, soaps, situation comedies, Lifetime movies, hospital dramas, police series, vampire and zombie serials, the dramas of housewives from Atlanta, New Jersey, Beverly Hills, and New York, the romances and quarrels of hotel fortune princesses and self-styled shahs, the cavorting of individuals made famous by happy nudities, the 15 minutes of fame accorded to young persons with large social media followings on account of their plastic surgery acquisition of a third breast, or their post-rib removal figures that mimicked the impossible shape of the Mattel company's Barbie doll, or even more simply, their ability to catch giant carp in picturesque settings while wearing only the tiniest of string bikinis. I'll just cut down to a little bit here. As time passed, and he sank ever deeper into the quicksand of what might be termed the unreal real, he felt himself becoming emotionally involved with many of the inhabitants of that other brighter world, membership in which he thought of as his to claim by right, like a latter-day Dorothy contemplating a permanent move to Oz. And at an unknown point, he developed an unwholesome because entirely one-sided passion for a certain television personality, the beautiful, witty, and adored Miss Salma R., an infatuation which he characterized quite inaccurately as love. In the name of this so-called love, he resolved zealously to pursue his beloved right through the television screen into whatever exalted, high-definition reality she and her kind inhabited, and by deeds as well as grace, to win her love. He's crazy.
I will say the strange thing about doing a virtual event is you can't hear the likely applause around the world right now after the read. It's a little quiet, but I'll clap.
Thank you. Well, there's this little line of comments going up the right-hand side, so
yeah,
we'll take that.
There. Something that I feel like, obviously it's alluded to in this section, but goes into much more depth throughout. The character of Quixote is, going crazy from watching TV. Did you go crazy from watching as much Bravo as you have seemed to have watched?
Well, the strange thing is that this has not been my television of choice most of my life. But once I had this idea that it's not just TV, it is in particular reality TV that the book sort of lampoons. I felt that I have to do my research. I can't describe what's in his head unless I know what's in his head, and so I did have to watch substantial quantities of bachelors and bachelorettes and all of that. Yeah, and now I don't have to.
Yeah. I'd love for you to talk about the role of the narrator and the story within the story, and what the responsibility of the reader is to understanding your role, Salman, outside of this. I feel like there's so much complication going on there. Well,
it's a kind of Russian doll of a book in that there is a story, the story which we've just been talking about, the Quixote story. We discover at the beginning of chapter 2 that story is being written by an author who is the central figure of the frame story, if you like. So it's and to tell you the truth, I wasn't planning to do that. I mean, I when I first thought of the book, I thought it would just be the story of Quixote and his Sancho making this crazy quest across the country. And then this other thing showed up about this imaginary author who turns out to be the author of that storyline, and isn't me. So I suppose there's me as the actual author creating an imaginary author who's creating the story that you're reading, and I wasn't. I mean, for a while, I just wasn't certain about it. I didn't know. I didn't know if I would keep that or not. And then I just became. I guess I thought it was interesting that what it showed the reader, I hope, is something about the nature of the act of creation, but something about how the circumstances of the ostensible author, his own life, are kind of transmuted into the story that he's telling. So he, for example, has a difficult relationship with a son. He has a strained relationship with a sister. He is increasingly worried about getting older and thinking, having thoughts of mortality, so on. And he gives versions of that to the character that he's telling, whose story he's telling, but not exactly the same. So what happens in the Quixote story is different than what happens in the author's story. And I thought that became interesting to me, the way the stories to some extent mirror each other, but then they go down different paths. So the created world doesn't follow the rules of the real world. And yeah, so in the end, I thought that might be interesting, and I decided to leave it in.
I think there's so many moments where the characters kind of give a nod to their creator or the questioning the creator. Yeah. And it feels like almost a sort of lesson in how you were processing the creation of the story, that you kind of let us behind the veil.
Well, a little bit. And it's also one of the things that I kind of got from Cervantes, because what happened in the writing of Don Quixote was that what is now book one of Don Quixote, he originally thought was going to be the whole book. He wasn't planning to write a book two. And then somebody else, an anonymous author, wrote a fake book two, and called it book two of Don Quixote. And Cervantes was so annoyed that he wrote his own book two in order to get rid of the imposter. And in book two of Don Quixote, both Don Quixote and Sancho Panza become aware that they're characters in books, and actually have very strong opinions about the books they're characters in, and are constantly trashing the fake Don Quixote. Don't read that, that's garbage. Read this one because it's good. And so that kind of self-consciousness, characters becoming aware of themselves as characters, strangely, I mean, this is so extraordinarily advanced that Cervantes should have done that in the early 17th century. And here we are 400 years later, still feels original, if you do it right. But yeah, I wanted a bit of that. I wanted a bit of self-consciousness.
There was a moment too where you talked about when a character takes more importance than the author originally intended, and then kind of moves into the center stage. Can you talk about the process and how that worked in this book for you?
Well, that's happened to me very often in books that I've written. That both ways, characters that I thought would be quite central, in the event, turned out to have less juice in them than I thought. And became more marginal, and characters who I thought were secondary just became so vivid to me on the page that they needed more space. They needed more space and time, and well, that's certainly what happened in this book with as I was saying, with the character of the so-called author. He wasn't supposed to be there at all, and he became very significant indeed. And then, of course, there is a game being played there between what you think about him and what you think about the person who wrote him, in other words, me. And that's just something I think for readers to have fun with, and enjoy.
Well, speaking of fun, it seemed like you had a lot of fun writing this book. You feel that sort of, even though it's dealing with a lot of difficult topics, that it seemed like it was a fun exercise for you. Would you?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you know, books are a strange kind of fun. They drive you mad. And they make you constantly aware of your own inadequacies. Um, but this one was enjoyable because I really wanted it to be funny. You know, I mean, actually, the world it's describing, I mean, it's quite black comedy. You know, I mean, the world it's describing includes you know, elements of violence and racism and so on. You know, but the tone of the book is comic, and once I got that, once I thought, okay, I think it's very important to get the tone of the book. You know, exactly how you're talking to the reader, not, you know, not what you're saying, but in what kind of language you're talking to the reader, and do you have your tongue in your cheek, or are you being pompous, or, you know, how are you doing it? Once you have that, then it becomes fun. Yeah, and one of the things that's been really pleasurable for me in, you know, the time since the book came out, is that a lot of readers have said to me that they really have thought it was the funniest book that I wrote. You know, starting with my literary agent, actually, who said that to me even before it was finished, and that was very encouraging at the time. It's what I needed to hear.
Yeah, I definitely had some audible snorts that caught my husband's attention. He said, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, just reading."
Good.
I'd love to just quickly point people to the chat area where Connor has posted links to buy Salman's book. There are regional independent bookstore options. Obviously, if you have an independent bookstore wherever you are, we'd love for you to support that. But here are some of our favorites. So please do buy Quixote. We are definitely here to celebrate this physical object that we'd love for you to have.
That would be great, because, you know, like most writers, I'm in love with independent bookstores, you know, and I mean, I have my favorites around the country, but without those, we'd all be in the soup, you know, because certainly the kind of books that I write, you know, are the books that independent bookstores do best at selling, you know. So and so I'm very happy to be able to join in supporting that cause.
Your algorithm defiers. I'd love for you to, so obviously, as you mentioned, and as is made obvious by the title, Cervantes is you know, inspiration for this book, but there are so many other writers and artists that you pull into this, and you talk a bit, or character talks a bit near the end about standing on the shoulders of giants and borrowing from other works. And can you just talk about
Yeah,
the muses?
I mean, obviously, I mean, this book, in a way, more than anything I've ever written, I think, tries to use the entire world of fiction as a way of trying to understand the present moment, you know. And so I mean, yeah, there's a lot of writers who, I mean, Cervantes obviously is the most obvious because it's in the title of the book, you know. But I was very interested in the way in which Charles Dickens writes, which is his ability to combine very seriously observed, realistically observed backgrounds, settings for his stories, and then these much larger than life characters that he projects against those settings, you know. And the characters become more enjoyable because they live in what is clearly a recognizably real world, you know. And I think that juxtaposition I liked, and I wanted to do something like that. There's a bit of the novel which took me by surprise, really. There's a moment in the novel when they arrive in a fictional town in New Jersey where people are turning into mastodons, which I believe not to be happening in New Jersey right at the moment.
Probably not.
But it could. And that really came out of a very old memory of mine. But when I was a student at Cambridge, I acted in a student production of Eugène Ionesco's play, The Rhinoceros, which is set in a small town in France in which people are turning into rhinoceroses. And I remember as a kid not understanding the play. And I remember saying to the director, what's this about? And he said, well, Salman, it's about fascism. It's about how people who are our neighbors can suddenly turn into something monstrous, and can suddenly become people we don't recognize, and we can't talk to them anymore, and yet a little while before, their children were playing with our children, and it's about that. And I thought, oh, that's very clever, and I felt a little bit that we, and not only in America, but we live in a moment in which something like that is happening, that the rifts in society are getting to be so deep that we begin to see others as monstrous, and alien, and people that we can't communicate with anymore, and so this old play by Ionesco, which was written, kind of after World War II, and as a way of responding to that kind of fascist period, suddenly seemed to me to have something to say about this moment. So Ionesco's in there, and the thing about optimism I was saying about Quixote. Well, one of the other great road novels is Voltaire's novel Candide, in which again there's a kind of holy fool, propelled across a Europe that's going through a terrible time, and the subtitle of Candide is optimism. The title is Candide or Optimism, and he has that quality of childlike optimism in the face of horror, and so Voltaire is in there too. So there's a whole bunch of people.
There's a lot I want to ask, but I'll start with just saying there's a moment in the book where you say that humans have a preference for fiction over fact, and I wonder if you've written across genre, nonfiction as well as fiction, but I wonder what your feeling is about that, and if it allows you to sort of tackle some more nuanced or intense topics through fiction because you feel the readers will be more receptive.
Well, I'm one of the things to disagree with myself. I think one of the interesting things that's happened in books, in the world of books in the last, let's say, 50 years, is the rise of this form of narrative nonfiction, in which people have used the techniques of fiction to tell true stories, and those books are very popular and very powerful in many ways, and I actually teach a course at New York University in narrative nonfiction for that reason, to look at this borderline between facts and imagination, and I think my books somewhat exist just on the other side of that borderline, on the fiction side of that borderline. And one of the things I just think is that human beings have a very deep need for story, that when children are born, of course, the first thing they want is to feel safe and loved and have a roof over their heads and food, and so on. But very soon after that, the request comes to tell me a story, and stories become the way in which we learn and understand the world, and I think if you go on to be a reader, then that goes on being something that you want, and that you feel you get from stories in a way that you don't get it from anywhere else. And I think that's people are always prophesying the death of the novel. Almost since the birth of the novel, people have started prophesying the death of the novel, and yet it obstinately persists. And I think the reason is that people get from fiction a pleasure and a stimulation that they don't get quite in that way from anything else. You don't get. I'm a big movie freak. I may be the last generation of movie freaks, because now everybody watches things on their computer, like this. Uh, but I was as influenced as a young person trying to be a writer. I was as influenced by movies as by literature, but movies are out there on a screen in front of you, and they tell you how to look at them. The magic of reading is that they're inside your head, and you, everything that you are interacts with everything that the book has, and together you make the book, and that kind of intimacy of strangers, is what makes reading such a joy. So, I mean, that's end of commercial.
In talking about sort of, the works that you were inspired by, but also with Quixote, it's so rooted in the now. And obviously you did not write it last week. You wrote it a few years ago.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, yeah.
But I wonder, as you're thinking about it now, and as you're continuing forward with talking about it after publication, if people have said how, I guess the question I'm asking is, it feels like the context is evergreen, and in reading it, it feels like you are talking about or nudging at COVID and the protests that are going on. And obviously Trump is in there, but it feels even richer than probably you maybe initially intended.
I mean, Trump's name is not in there, and that's quite deliberate.
Yeah.
I thought we hear that name often enough.
Right.
You don't want to hear him on my pages. But the things that it tries to get at, I think, are kind of always with us. I mean, we live in a moment of huge and justified protest against American racism and against the way in which this country or parts of this country have historically treated and continue to treat Black people predominantly, and so given that this journey across America goes through all sorts of Americas, it seemed it would be chickening out to not face the fact that these brown men, this brown man and his imaginary brown son, were going to come across some hostility because of that, and I didn't want it to be the only thing the book was about, but I also didn't want to pretend that it wasn't so, and so it is so. There's, I think, 3 occasions in the book when they encounter racial prejudice, and sometimes it's just language, and sometimes it's more physically dangerous. But I wanted it to be there because here we are, and the kind of divided society that the book talks about, wasn't invented yesterday. That division has been deepening in, as I say, not only in America, because I think if you look at the 3 countries that I've written about and cared about in my life, which are India and England, and for the last 20 years, America, you can see that in all of them. You can see that deepening gulf, different kinds of gulf, but that broken society, is true of all 3 of those places, and the book wants to recognize that too. It does try and recognize that this is not some kind of exclusively American issue, that is broader than that.
In the piece that you wrote, I think it was 2 weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal, about that you've seen dictators rise and fall.
In the Washington Post. Yeah.
You mentioned kind of at the end of that about how in this book, it's the age of anything can happen. And I would like you to just kind of talk about maybe peace and.
Well, look, if Donald Trump can be president, then anything can happen. I think on that terrible day in 2016, I think even he wasn't expecting it. If you look at his face on the tapes of that night, it's the face of a man in shock. What, I've really got to do this job now. But I do think that we live in a moment in which the world can be transformed in an instant. And I mean, that you're talking about the coronavirus epidemic, the pandemic. That's an example of it. I mean, here we are, in June. In January, none of us would have believed that our lives were going to be turned on their heads, and yet, in, I guess, the middle of March onwards, that's what happened, like in the blink of an eye, and that's, I mean, obviously I wasn't predicting a plague, but I was saying that we live in a moment in which enormous changes can happen at great speed, and the pandemic is a terrible example of that.
I'm going to soon go over to audience questions, so if folks have them, be typing them in. I see that there are already a lot there, but I would love for you to talk a little bit about, I mean, obviously you are a champion of free speech, have experienced, moments in your own life where that's been stifled. And I wonder if you have anything you want to say about like the protests that are going on right now and how art might be a balm or a tool in that.
Well, first of all, I have to, express my admiration for the protesters. I think it's quite extraordinary what has erupted across the country, and I'm glad that after an initial moment, the protests have become so orderly, that they haven't stopped being huge, but they stopped being something that could be characterized as rioting, because I think that was in danger of changing the narrative, and undoing the work of the protesters, which is important. So, but I mean, I think it comes out of, you mentioned the article that I wrote in the Post about Trump. I mean, that was an article that was written, I have to say, out of pure rage. I watched the television images of mounted soldiers and tear gas bombs being released at American citizens by American military. I thought, that's just hideous. And I have seen dictatorships in other countries, and this is how dictators behave. This is not how democratic presidents behave. That was a moment at which I felt that democracy in this country was in real danger, and the peace came out of that. And I think the anger being expressed across the country right now comes out of that. It comes out of this sense that, if you're a certain kind of person, that's to say, if you have the wrong kind of skin, then in many ways this is not a free country. You're a person in constant danger of being shot dead while sleeping in your bed at home. You could be shot dead, while dozing off at a Wendy's in the drive-through lane. Probably not a good thing to do, but death is not the correct response to that, and this idea that people, for the most trivial of reasons or no reason, can be killed, is something which I think people are just sick of, and it's very interesting to me that I thought in the early days of the pandemic that was very likely to be a kind of a tipping point of some kind, and would oblige us all to do some serious rethinking, about how we have lived and how we should live. And now it seems that this protest, that this may in fact be the tipping point, that there's kind of no going back from this. There's only going forward. And it's extraordinary to see everybody jumping on board, and sometimes I believe that to be sincere and sometimes not so sincere. But there's a real shift. And what is extraordinary and inspiring is the fact that these protests have inspired protests around the world, and where people are using this as a springboard to talk about the inequities of their own societies, and the prejudices of their own societies and what needs to change there. So this has been more than just an American inspiration; it's a global inspiration. And I think more power to them.
As you mentioned earlier, obviously storytelling is a really important component to how we move forward. Storytelling is going to be a need or is a necessity. And I know that the Loft is working on some classes and different resources for folks, including how to write letters to your senators and congresspeople, and maybe somebody who's works at the Loft and is on this right now could put a link to that. But I would also encourage, I know that the Believer and Portland Book Festival and Wisconsin Book Festival are all doing things to sort of be supportive to our Black communities, and we're all learning and trying to help. I want to move towards the audience questions here.
Just to say, I think there's a lot of writers now in America, including me, just trying to think how, as artists, we respond to this, and I think one of the things to say is that, I wrote an op-ed in the newspaper. That seems to me to be the immediate way of how to respond to this, because literature, fiction, books, they're slow. They take a long time, and they are not the best way to respond to a political game-changing moment, but obviously you have to think about what is the implication of this for the books that you will write in the future, and I think there's a lot of us working that out, and I think in the years to come we'll see the answer to those questions in different ways from different writers.
That addresses our first question here from Serena. She asks if you found it difficult to write since the beginning of the world's lockdown, and maybe you could talk about that in the context of writing sort of immediate responses and what you're.
No, it's so strange. I've had more than one person saying to me, "This must be a great time to be a novelist." I mean, there's so much time. You're home and there's nothing to do, and must be a great. And I think, over 100,000 people have died. It doesn't feel like that great a time, and I have found it quite hard to. I mean, I was actually when the pandemic started, I was actually more than 100 pages into something that I was trying to write, and it just suddenly seemed to me to be completely stupid, and in the light of the world we were now living in, and I just put it away. I mean, I don't know if I'll ever go back to it, but maybe not. And since then, it's been difficult. I mean, now I'm just beginning to think I may have the beginning of something, but we'll see. It's a really hard. I think it's a hard time to be a writer because what's happening seems to be, in a way, more important than that. It may be. You were mentioning about listening and learning, and it may be a time for that.
This question is from Anjan. Has the post-internet world added any new thinking tools or toys to the mythologist's toolkit?
Well, I mean, the thing about the internet is that it's a tool. It is just a tool. It's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It's neither moral nor immoral. The question is how it's used. You can use a knife to cut your dinner, and you can use a knife to stab somebody. So the knife is morally neutral. And I think the best of the internet has been colossally valuable. In allowing us to talk to each other instantly, globally, in allowing us to have a reach into the world's knowledge, which was previously very hard to access unless you went to libraries and dug into them. You can now go into libraries online, and so it's been politically useful. I mean, in various times, in the so-called Arab Spring, the internet was enormously important as a kind of way of organizing. And then there's the other side, which, the kind of less pleasant side of the internet, which is mean-spirited and kind of bitchy and nasty and makes you not want to be in that room, and some of that has to do with anonymity. The fact that everybody is behind some kind of handle, like Mike Quixote writing his anonymous letters, behind this pseudonym he's invented for himself, Quixote. It's not his name. Now we all have pseudonyms, we're all hiding behind pseudonyms, writing letters to each other, and sometimes that gives some of us permission to behave in a way that you would not behave if somebody knew your name and you were standing in the room next to them, and so it sort of gives license to bad behavior sometimes. And I worry about that. But I think, as I say, a lot of it is unbelievably useful.
You would hope people wouldn't behave that way in the same room, but maybe.
You think it might?
Yeah. This question is from Scott. Can you speak a bit about your humanist belief system and how it informs your work? How important is it for society to evolve in a secular direction? What is the role of literature and art in displacing religion and fulfilling the human need for inspiration and meaning?
My, is that all?
Yes, play it one.
Yeah, in 2 sentences.
Tell us more.
Well, let me just say, that really is, we could have a whole evening on that question. But I'll just say one thing. One of the things I like about some of the old mythologies is the way in which they suggest that there's a point at which human beings outgrow the divine. Let's say if in Norse mythology, there's this thing called the Twilight of the Gods, which is actually a great battle between the gods and their enemies, at the end of which both the gods and their enemies are dead, and what's left is just us by ourselves. We have to do the best we can without gods. And even in the Greek and Roman stories, there's a moment. Roberto Colasso wrote a book called The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, which was an event which is supposed to be the last time that the gods ever came down from Olympus and joined in with human beings at this marriage feast. After that, they went up the mountain and they had nothing to do with us anymore. So this idea that you have the gods for a while, but at a certain point, you have to stand on your own feet. It's sort of in a way like kids growing up in a family, but eventually you leave home, and you have to make your own life in your own way. I like that idea. I think that the idea that we need these things at a certain point in our development, and then we outgrow them. And I came from a very secularist family, and so I was brought up in a way. I was kind of excused religion, and that's kind of always been my position.
I'm just going to say a comment from the sidebar here for Becky saying her 3 favorite cities for supporting this event. I'll just add that it's 4 cities. I'll assume Minneapolis was among the 3 there, but this is the Loft's Wordplay in Minneapolis, the Wisconsin Book Festival, the Portland Book Festival, and the Believer Festival in Vegas. And Sara Ortiz, Connor Moran, and Amanda Bullock all helped put this together. So just big shout out to this group. And I'm going to keep asking questions, but I just wanted to do that before the end in case people signed up when it was my turn to talk again. I actually am going to look at the sidebar again for a quick question because this comes from the amazing Rachel Rokiki. Can Salman speak to the everyone's favorite? Can Salman speak to the character of the doctor in the novel and the opioid thread?
Oh yeah. Well, look, there's one of the things I tend to do is to try and keep my finger on the pulse of what Indian Americans are getting up to, both good and bad. And I came across a true story, which I fictionalized, about a real life doctor who was in the pharmaceutical business and whose company invented an opioid, which was very powerful and intended only for terminal cancer patients. But because he was kind of a crook, he managed to bribe numbers of doctors to prescribe this to people who were not dying of cancer, and created addictions and became a billionaire and has now gone to jail. So that's the story out of which I created a character of a bent doctor involved in the opioid crisis. And again, it's partly to do with the fact that the part of the central part of the novel, which goes across the central part of America, it is going through the areas where the opioid addiction is at its worst. So again, it seemed natural to include it, and unnatural to exclude it, because we're talking about the colossal amount of deaths caused by this pandemic, but the opioid crisis has been causing something like 70,000 deaths a year, in this country alone, for several years now. So it's like this other pandemic, which obviously gets less attention because it's not catching, but it's a colossal event in American life, and I felt that in a way it comes out of, we were talking about the internet earlier, live in this world where in theory we have so many ways of connecting with each other now. We have so many platforms, so many ways of talking to each other, and yet paradoxically, it may be that some of us are getting lonelier. That there's a sense of isolation, separation, and that drug addiction is a kind of refuge, for people who are isolated and broken in that way. So I thought that it's just, yes, it's if you like a news story, but it's also a story which goes somewhere close to the heart of what's happening in the country. So that's why that story is in there. And I mean, my Quixote is actually he works for the doctor. He's a pharmaceutical salesman, or X1, and the woman he loves, his TV star, is actually an addict. So by a kind of dark paradox, the thing that brings them together actually is addiction, and yeah. So I just wanted it to be there because I think it actually is something which isn't talked about, I think, as much as it should be.
For those of you that are just coming to Quixote for the first time, I definitely want to encourage you to purchase a copy. And if you've already read it, you know how wonderful it is, and you might want to get one for a friend to send to at home during.
Get several.
Yeah, get several. So Connor, if you want to post the links again on the side here while I get the next question up here. So we've talked about this a little bit, but I think that this goes into it a little bit more specifically, and obviously people are using you, Salman, as a sage here. So for this question, much of your work plays with the questions and questions the thin existent line between fact and fiction. How do you think people form their beliefs? In other words, how do we decide what is true? Is there a particular system or means by which we go about forming our beliefs?
Yeah, well, again, how long have you got? But I do think, and it's one of the things I think the book really, it's very near the center of what the book deals with, is that we live in a time in which there's been a real assault on the idea of truth, which has led to a kind of breakdown in many cases of people's ability, as the questioner says, the breakdown of the ability to distinguish lies from truth. And that's, for any society, a matter of enormous danger, because that's one of the points at which a dictator can emerge and say, "Believe me, because I am the truth." That's when you don't believe what you're being told, when you think what you're being told is a lie, you're in a very vulnerable situation. If you can't distinguish. One of the things that I don't want to overclaim for literature, because there are things that books can do and there are things that books can't do. Books can't solve the problems of the world. Books very occasionally have a direct impact on public events. I think, Uncle Tom's Cabin is an example of a book that did. Mostly books don't work like that, but what I think does happen in reading a book is that the writer and the reader make a kind of contract with each other, about how the world is. And when you read a book that absorbs you and that speaks to you, it tells you something about how you should see the world, and the book's view of the world a little bit becomes a part of your view of the world, and my view about fiction is that it's all about the truth. I mean, it can have flying carpets in it, but it's still about the truth. It's about the deep truths about human nature, how we are, what we do to each other, why we do these things, how can we understand ourselves. I think that's what literature has always been about, and that's why it survives, because we all ask ourselves these questions every day, and that's the way I think in which literature fiction can help to give us back a sense of the truth, because it's a sense that we have from reading books that we love, and as I say, beyond that, there's a whole area which is for politics, which is not for literature, where there are things that books can't do. They can't solve the problems, but they can define them, and they can ask the questions about the problems that need to be asked.
This question is from Ramona. Do you see parallels between the current systemic racism, discrimination, and prejudice in current India and the United States?
Yeah, I mean, there are differences. I mean, what's happening in India has as much to do with religious sectarianism as racial hatred. So what's happening there is that the Hindu nationalist governing party is using the pandemic as a way of blaming Muslims, basically. So it's deepening a kind of communal divide rather than a racial divide. In the Brexit England, one of the main thrusts of the Brexiteers was to create a distrust of immigrants, and to feel that, and to make people feel that immigrants in England were somehow damaging the fabric of the society, and if they could only be got rid of, then the country would be better off. So that kind of anti-foreigner prejudice was whipped up, by that campaign, which succeeded, and it's still there. It's still there. And so, in all, as I say, these three countries that I've spent my life writing about, variations of this problem are in all three. They're not. There's nothing in the UK or India which is like the United States' experiences of slavery and what came afterwards. So that's something particular to this country. I mean, the British were involved in the slave trade, and they often try and make you forget that, but they were. But its place at the center of the history of this country is unlike what happened in those other countries. But these other countries have their versions of politically whipped up hatred, which is poisoning the body politic.
Got another. I'm gonna give you a break here from the philosophical kind of big question.
Yes. Actually, yes. No, I mean, I'm glad you asked this. As it happens, I have the answer to everything.
You referenced the Twilight Zone episode, The Invaders. Was this a sort of antidote to all the saccharine reality TV reference? Are you a fan of sci-fi drama?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things that really helped me in this book to solve some of the problems of the book was the fact that when I was much younger, I used to be a kind of addict of science fiction. I read an enormous amount of science fiction and watched some of it on TV. And there were particularly two stories that stuck in my mind, and stories I literally probably hadn't thought about since I was in my teens, which at certain points in this book cropped up in my head and solved problems in the storyline. One of them was a story that was on dramatized on American television. It was originally a short story called Pictures Don't Lie. by a writer called Catherine MacLean. I think it was an episode of something. I don't know if it was The Twilight Zone, but of something. And the other one was a story by Arthur C. Clarke called The 9 Billion Names of God. The way I've used elements of those stories in the book is very, very different to the way in which the original stories were. But science fiction certainly gave me a way of developing the storyline in this book, because, you know, the last act of the book is kind of about the end of the world, you know, and the end of the world has always been a very popular theme for science fiction writers. You know, I always remembered that when Douglas Adams wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Earth is blown up on page 1. And actually it started off as a radio series, and on radio, you know, you can blow up the world very cheaply. and so, you know, that whole saga began with the end of the world. I mean, mine only works up towards it. And I think what mostly end of the world stories are actually not really about the end of the world, but what they're about is about maybe the end of a world, you know, and what I felt when I was writing this book was that many of the things about the world I'd grown up in and had lived in, you know, were changing or were being changed or broken to such a degree that I felt maybe the world that I had grown up in and lived in was coming to an end, and I wasn't exactly sure what world would come after it, you know. And I think since then, this double crisis that we've all faced and are facing, I think must put questions like that in all our heads. You know, what is the world going to be like after this, and will it be better or worse? You know, I mean, obviously, I tend to want to be an optimist. So I would like to hope that things would be better after this, that we might learn some lessons. But we can be a very stupid species, and sometimes we don't learn the lessons.
That seems like a really solid note to wrap this up on. Even the comments that maybe tomorrow is a special day for you. Is tomorrow your birthday?
No, it's the day after tomorrow.
Okay.
I've always been rather proud of the fact that my birthday is on Juneteenth.
Oh, yeah.
And this year, of course, I think Juneteenth is going to be a bigger deal than ever. And I'm just happy for eat my little piece of cake in the corner. But yeah, it will be my birthday in 2 days.
Well, happy early birthday.
Thank you.
So much for joining us in this strange and new terrain of virtual events. It's such a delight to talk to you and to be here with so many of your fans.
Well, I'm going to go and look at all these comments now. I haven't been able to look at them while we've been talking, but I'm going to check them out. So thank you, everybody. Really, thank you for showing up and helping us to make this new way of being with each other.
And I'll just add at the end here, there's a survey at the bottom that would help us plan further events, future events. Again, this was brought to you by the Lofts Wordplay, the Portland Book Festival, the Believer Festival in Las Vegas, and the Wisconsin Book Festival. And go buy Quixote. It is well worth your time and energy. It's just a delight. I mean, it's a delightful read, even though it's all the things that we talked about today, too. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.